Inside the U.S. Navy's Submarine Training Center in Groton, Connecticut, a line of young submarine officer candidates waited nervously outside one of the most difficult simulation rooms in the fleet. The exercise was infamous. Every trainee had to command a fast-attack submarine through a catastrophic emergency involving flooding, electrical failure, reactor limitations, sonar confusion, and an approaching enemy destroyer. 12 candidates had already attempted the scenario that morning. All 12 had failed. Some lost propulsion, others surfaced too early and were detected. A few flooded critical compartments before reaching safe water. In the observation area stood a quiet 80-year-old man wearing a faded Navy submarine jacket embroidered with long retired qualification dolphins, a white veteran's cap, and carrying a worn leather navigation logbook beneath one arm. Leaning on a polished mahogany cane, he watched every simulation without saying a single word. Unlike the instructors, he never looked at the computer screens first. Instead, he quietly listened to the sonar speakers, watched the depth gauges, and occasionally closed his eyes, as though hearing something nobody else could. A group of young submarine cadets noticed him. One smiled, "Grandpa looks like he wants a turn." Another laughed, "He probably served before computers were invented." A third pointed toward the old man studying the control console. "Careful, sir. This simulator is a little more complicated than museum exhibits." The room filled with laughter. The elderly veteran simply smiled politely and waited until the final cadet left the simulator, shaking his head in frustration. Then he slowly approached the chief instructor. "Excuse me," he asked calmly. "If today's schedule allows, may I attempt the scenario?" Several cadets immediately laughed again. One whispered, "He won't even know where to start." Another grinned, "The reactor will melt down before he leaves the pier." The chief instructor hesitated, uncertain how to answer. Before he could speak, the commanding officer of the training center entered the control room after hearing the conversation. Captain Rebecca Lawson looked toward the elderly visitor for only a brief moment before immediately coming to attention and rendering a sharp naval salute. "Master Chief Robert Bob Callahan," she said with unmistakable respect. "The control room has been waiting for you for 27 years. Every cadet froze. Moments earlier, they had believed the quiet old man was simply another curious visitor. None of them realized they were standing beside one of the U.S. Navy's most respected submarine sonar and tactical instructors. A man who had spent 36 years beneath the ocean, helped design many of the emergency procedures still taught to submarine crews, and once guided a crippled nuclear submarine safely home after a devastating underwater collision that experts believed no crew could survive. Hidden inside the worn leather navigation logbook he carried was the original handwritten record of that mission, along with one sealed letter from the commanding officer who never returned to sea. Before the simulator shut down that afternoon, every cadet would discover why experience can hear what technology sometimes misses, learn the heartbreaking promise preserved inside the old logbook, and witness an 80-year-old submariner calmly complete the one emergency mission that every younger officer had failed. The submarine simulator at the Naval Submarine Training Center in Groton, Connecticut, had defeated every officer candidate who entered it that morning. 12 attempts had ended in failure. Some candidates lost propulsion after mishandling the electrical casualty. Others surfaced too early and exposed the submarine to the simulated destroyer closing from the east. 2 flooded the forward compartment before completing the emergency isolation sequence. By noon, frustration had settled over the entire control room. Behind the observation glass stood an 80-year-old man wearing a faded Navy submarine jacket, a white veteran's cap, and carrying a worn leather navigation logbook beneath one arm. A polished mahogany cane supported his slow steps. He had watched every failed attempt without offering advice. He rarely looked at the main tactical display. Instead, he listened to the sonar speakers, studied the depth gauges, and occasionally closed his eyes as though the room were telling him something no one else could hear. A group of young candidates noticed him after the 10th failure. "Grandpa has been staring at the sonar screen for an hour," one whispered. Another laughed. "Maybe he thinks it's a museum exhibit." A third grinned. "He probably served before submarines had computers." The old man heard them but only smiled. When the 12th candidate emerged from the simulator pale and exhausted, the chief instructor announced a temporary break. The elderly visitor slowly walked toward him. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Would it be possible for me to attempt the scenario?" The candidates nearby burst into laughter. One shook his head. Sir, this isn't a historical demonstration. Another added, the simulation starts with 3 failures at once. You won't even know which screen to watch. The old man nodded calmly. That may be true. The chief instructor looked uncomfortable. Sir, the simulator is restricted to authorized personnel. I understand. The old man adjusted the logbook beneath his arm and began to step away. At that moment, the control room door opened. Captain Rebecca Lawson, commanding officer of the training center, entered after hearing that an elderly visitor had requested access to the simulator. She looked across the room, saw the old man, and stopped immediately. Then she came to attention and rendered a sharp naval salute. Master Chief Robert Callahan. She said with unmistakable respect, "Welcome back." The laughter vanished. Every candidate froze. Robert returned the salute with quiet precision. "Good afternoon, Captain." Rebecca smiled. "You should have told us you were coming." Robert looked through the glass toward the simulator. "I wanted to see whether the problem was still difficult." One candidate glanced at another in confusion. Rebecca turned toward the room. For those of you who don't recognize him, Master Chief Callahan spent 36 years in the submarine service. He helped develop emergency sonar and casualty response procedures still used throughout the fleet. She pointed toward the simulator. The scenario all 12 of you failed was based partly on an incident he survived. Complete silence settled over the room. Robert looked toward the dark control stations beyond the glass. Survived is one way to describe it. Rebecca's expression became more serious. "You mean the USS Resolute?" Robert nodded once. 27 years ago, we lost power, flooded 2 compartments, and had a destroyer searching directly above us. The candidates stared at him. One finally asked, "How did you get out?" Robert gently tapped the worn logbook beneath his arm. By listening to what the submarine was telling us before the instruments understood it, Rebecca opened the simulator door. "The control room is yours, Master Chief." Robert rested his cane beside the entrance and slowly stepped inside. Before taking the command chair, he looked back at the candidates who had laughed. "Come closer," he said kindly. "You may as well see where all of you made the same mistake." The control room became completely silent. As Master Chief Robert Callahan lowered himself into the command chair, every submarine officer candidate gathered behind the observation glass, watching the elderly veteran study the simulator with calm curiosity rather than urgency. Unlike the younger officers before him, Robert did not immediately touch a single control. He simply looked around the compartment, resting one hand lightly on the edge of the periscope console, while listening to the quiet hum of the simulated submarine. One of the candidates whispered, "Why isn't he doing anything?" The chief instructor smiled faintly. "Because he's already gathering information." Captain Rebecca Lawson nodded toward the simulation operator. "Reset the scenario." Seconds later, warning alarms echoed through the control room. The display flashed rapidly. Electrical fault. Flooding detected in auxiliary machinery. Reactor output restricted. Sonar contact bearing 085. Possible hostile destroyer. The same emergency that had defeated 12 young officers began once again. Robert remained perfectly calm. Instead of reaching for the throttle or issuing immediate orders, he quietly closed his eyes for just 2 seconds. The candidates exchanged puzzled glances. One whispered, "Did he just stop?" Another replied, "He's wasting time." Robert then opened his eyes and spoke his first command, "Reduce unnecessary communication." The simulator crew looked surprised but complied. The room instantly became quieter. Robert tilted his head slightly toward the sonar speakers. "Increase passive sonar volume." "Aye, Master Chief." The low rhythmic sounds of the ocean filled the compartment. Robert listened carefully without looking at the tactical display. "Interesting," he murmured. One instructor frowned. "Sir?" Robert smiled slightly. "The destroyer isn't hunting." Several candidates looked confused. Captain Lawson folded her arms. "Explain." Robert pointed toward the sonar speaker. "Listen to the propeller rhythm." No one answered. Robert continued. "If they were actively searching, their speed would be changing constantly." He tapped the edge of the console. "Instead, they're maintaining almost perfect engine revolutions." The chief instructor looked back at the simulation data. His eyes widened. "He's right." Robert nodded. "That means they're following a predicted search pattern." One candidate whispered, "None of us even noticed that." Robert smiled. "Because you were watching the screens." He gently tapped one ear. "Submarines don't fight with their eyes." He looked toward the sonar operator. "They fight with their ears." The candidates fell silent. Robert then reached for the navigation controls for the very first time. Come 5 degrees starboard. Maintain depth. Reduce speed another 2 knots. One instructor looked surprised. Sir, that makes escape slower. Robert calmly shook his head. Only if you're trying to outrun the destroyer. He smiled. I'm trying to let it miss us. Captain Lawson quietly nodded, recognizing the lesson immediately. Robert continued issuing calm, precise orders while the younger candidates watched every movement. There was no panic, no unnecessary shouting. Every command came only after several seconds of quiet observation. Then another alarm sounded, flooding increasing in auxiliary compartment. One candidate whispered, "Now he'll have to isolate it." Robert looked toward the engineering panel but never reached for the emergency isolation switch. Instead, he asked a single unexpected question. What's the compartment temperature? The engineering operator checked the display. Dropping slowly, sir. Robert smiled. Good. Several candidates frowned in confusion. Good? Robert nodded. That tells us the flooding is entering from below, not from a ruptured steam line. Captain Lawson looked toward the chief instructor. Did any candidate ask for compartment temperature today? The instructor slowly shook his head. Not one. Robert gently opened the worn leather navigation logbook resting beside him. Between its yellowed pages lay an old chart marked with faded pencil notes and water stains. Tucked inside the back cover was a sealed envelope that had clearly remained unopened for decades. Captain Lawson noticed it immediately. You're still carrying it. Robert rested one hand on the logbook and smiled quietly. I promised him I would. The captain lowered her voice. Commander Harris? Robert nodded once. He told me not to open it until I knew another generation of submarine officers had learned to hear the ocean. Instead of just reading the instruments, no one in the room spoke. Outside the observation glass, every candidate realized they were no longer watching a simulator exercise. They were watching 40 years of experience quietly teaching lessons that no computer could ever fully explain. The simulator continued running as warning alarms echoed through the control room, but unlike every candidate before him, Master Chief Robert Callahan never allowed the alarms to dictate his decisions. He listened first. Then he acted. The submarine remained deep beneath the simulated Atlantic, while the hostile destroyer continued searching above. Flooding slowly increased inside the auxiliary machinery compartment. Electrical power remained unstable, and reactor output was still limited. Every younger officer who had attempted the scenario had reacted immediately to the alarms. Robert reacted to the ocean instead. Maintain present depth, he said calmly. Do not change speed. One candidate whispered, Why isn't he escaping? Captain Rebecca Lawson smiled faintly. Because he already knows the destroyer expects him to run. Robert leaned slightly toward the sonar speakers again. The steady rhythm of propellers echoed through the compartment. Suddenly, he asked another unexpected question. Any biologics? The sonar operator looked surprised before checking the display. Yes, sir. Large school of fish bearing 090. Robert nodded. Exactly where I expected. Several candidates looked at one another in confusion. Robert smiled. Good. Bring us 5 degrees toward them. One instructor frowned. Sir, that takes us closer to the destroyer. Robert gently shook his head. No. He pointed toward the sonar display. It takes us closer to something much noisier than we are. The chief instructor looked carefully at the tactical screen before quietly saying, The fish school will distort the sonar return. Robert nodded. Now you're thinking underwater. The submarine slowly entered the dense biological layer. Immediately, the sonar picture became cluttered with random echoes. Above them, the destroyer altered course slightly. Misidentifying the growing acoustic signature, Captain Lawson folded her arms with a smile. First false contact. Robert never celebrated. Keep moving. Another alarm suddenly sounded. Battery reserve falling. One candidate whispered nervously. Now he has to increase reactor output. Robert calmly replied before anyone else could. Negative. He turned toward engineering. Secure every non-essential electrical load. Aye, sir. Lights throughout the simulated submarine dimmed slightly. One cadet looked confused. That won't solve the problem. Robert smiled. No, it buys us time. He looked toward the engineering panel. Time is the only thing submariners can never manufacture. The candidates wrote the sentence down almost instinctively. Seconds later, the destroyer launched another active sonar pulse. The loud metallic ping echoed through the simulator. Several younger officers instinctively tensed. Robert did not even flinch. Helm, he said quietly. 3 degrees down bubble. Maintain silence. The submarine slipped beneath a colder layer of water. The sonar operator stared at his display. Thermal layer established. Robert nodded. Good. Captain Lawson looked toward the candidates. How many of you crossed the thermal layer? No one answered. Why not? Robert replied for them. Because they were trying to solve the emergency. He smiled gently. I was trying to solve the ocean. Complete silence filled the room. For the first time that day, the tactical display changed. Enemy destroyer has lost reliable sonar contact. One instructor looked at the simulation timer in disbelief. This is the farthest anyone has reached. Robert remained focused. Don't relax yet. He pointed toward the navigation display. The dangerous part starts now. Captain Lawson glanced toward the worn leather logbook beside Robert. Partially visible beneath its final page was the corner of the same sealed envelope that had remained unopened for 27 years. She quietly remembered the last conversation she had ever heard about it. Commander James Harris had handed Robert that letter only hours before the collision aboard the USS Resolute and said, "If we make it home, burn this." Robert had smiled and replied, "And if we don't?" Harris answered with words Robert had carried ever since. "Then open it only after you find a crew that already knows how to survive." The simulator remained eerily quiet as the submarine continued moving beneath the thermal layer. For the first time that day, the tactical display showed the enemy destroyer searching in the wrong direction. Every submarine officer candidate stood motionless behind the observation glass. None of them had ever seen the scenario progress this far. Master Chief Robert Callahan remained calm, issuing only a few carefully chosen commands, while the younger officers stared at the screens in amazement. Suddenly, the simulation announced its final emergency. Flooding stabilized. Battery reserve critical. Navigation uncertainty increasing. Mission timer. 8 minutes remaining. The chief instructor quietly shook his head. This is where everyone fails. Robert smiled gently. Because this is where everyone starts chasing the clock. He rested one hand on the navigation console. Helm, hold course. One instructor looked surprised. Sir, shouldn't we head directly toward the extraction point? Robert slowly shook his head. Not yet. He pointed toward the navigation display. The destroyer thinks we're running for home. So? A candidate asked. Robert smiled. Let's disappoint them. Instead of taking the shortest route, Robert guided the submarine through a narrow underwater canyon, shown only on the detailed navigation chart. One candidate frowned. That adds nearly 4 minutes. Robert nodded. It also blocks active sonar from 2 directions. Captain Rebecca Lawson quietly smiled. Terrain masking. Robert nodded once. The ocean has mountains too. As the submarine entered the canyon, the destroyer's sonar contact disappeared completely. The simulation displayed a new message. Enemy search pattern lost. Several instructors exchanged astonished looks. The chief instructor whispered, "No candidate has ever used the canyon." Robert answered without turning around, because no one looked beyond the obvious route. A few moments later, the final objective marker appeared ahead. Robert calmly reduced speed, aligned the submarine precisely, and completed the emergency rendezvous sequence without triggering a single additional warning. A soft tone echoed through the simulator. Mission complete. Complete silence filled the control room. No one moved. The chief instructor looked at the final evaluation screen, blinking twice as if he thought it must be wrong. Successful mission, he read quietly. 0 crew casualties. 0 detection events. Mission completed with 14% battery reserve remaining. 12 younger officers had failed. An 80-year-old submariner had completed the entire scenario on his first attempt. The candidates slowly rose to their feet. Without anyone giving an order, applause spread through the simulator until every instructor and every officer candidate was standing. Robert simply smiled, removed his hands from the controls, and quietly closed the worn leather logbook resting beside him. Captain Lawson stepped into the simulator, carrying the old logbook. "Master Chief," she said softly, "I think it's finally time." Robert looked down at the sealed envelope tucked inside the back cover. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he carefully removed it. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Across the front were just a few words. "For Bob, open only after you know they'll make better decisions than we did." Robert gently broke the seal. Every person in the simulator stood in complete silence as he unfolded the letter written by Commander James Harris 27 years earlier. He took a slow breath and began to read. "If you're holding this letter, then another generation has learned the lesson that took us almost too long to understand. Never let fear make your decisions faster than your thinking. The ocean has never been our enemy. Panic has always been the real danger. Trust your crew, trust your training. And when every alarm tells you to rush, remember that the safest decision is often the one made after listening for one more second. Robert lowered the letter, his eyes quietly filling with tears. Captain Lawson looked toward the young officers surrounding them. "Today," she said proudly, "you didn't just watch someone complete a simulator exercise." She smiled at Robert. "You watched 27 years of experience save a submarine that existed only inside a computer. So one day, it might save a real one beneath the sea." Robert pointed toward the simulator displays that had been flashing alarms throughout the exercise. "You believed the emergency was trying to defeat you." He paused for a moment. "It wasn't." Complete silence settled over the room. Robert continued. "The scenario wasn't testing whether you could react the fastest." He rested one hand against the sonar console. "It was testing whether you could remain calm long enough to understand what the submarine was trying to tell you." Captain Rebecca Lawson nodded thoughtfully. "That's why you spent the first few seconds listening, instead of issuing orders." Robert smiled. "Submarines speak." A few candidates smiled uncertainly. Robert laughed softly. "Not with words." He gently tapped the sonar speaker. "With sound." He pointed toward the engineering panel. "With vibration." Then toward the depth gauge. "With pressure." Finally, he looked around the compartment. If the commanding officer learns to listen before reacting, the entire crew survives. He slowly opened the worn leather navigation logbook one final time. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded sheet of paper covered with faded handwriting. "Commander Harris and I wrote these after the Resolute returned to port," he explained. Captain Lawson carefully unfolded the page. Across the top were 3 simple principles written in dark blue ink. "Listen before you command. Think before you react. Every calm decision gives your crew another chance to come home." The room remained completely silent. Robert smiled gently. Those 3 sentences saved more submarines than any piece of equipment ever could. Captain Lawson looked toward the officer candidates. "Beginning today," she announced, "every submarine officer candidate who trains in this simulator will receive these principles before taking command for the first time." A quiet murmur of approval spread throughout the room. Lawson then turned toward Robert once more. "There's something else I'd like you to see." Together, they walked into the training center's heritage gallery, where a polished glass display case stood beneath a dark blue cloth. Lawson carefully removed the covering. Inside rested Robert's weathered navigation logbook, Commander James Harris's letter, the original emergency navigation chart from the USS Resolute, and the handwritten training principles that had shaped generations of submarine officers. At the center of the display was a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Callahan-Harris Submarine Leadership Legacy," dedicated to Master Chief Robert Callahan and Commander James Harris, whose courage, judgment, and calm leadership continue guiding every crew beneath the sea. "The safest submarine is commanded by the officer who listens before he acts." Robert stood quietly for several moments before smiling. "James would have complained that my name came first." Captain Lawson laughed. "I'm certain he would have." Robert nodded toward the plaque. "Then let's pretend he's still giving me orders." Gentle laughter echoed through the gallery. Years later, after Master Chief Robert Callahan passed away peacefully at the age of 89, every newly qualified submarine officer entering the training center stopped first at that display before ever touching the simulator controls. Before learning about reactors, navigation systems, sonar, or emergency procedures, they first learned the story of one quiet submariner who returned as an ordinary visitor, listened to the ocean more carefully than anyone else in the room, and completed the mission that every younger officer had failed. Beside the display, one final inscription greeted every future commander. "The ocean rarely rewards the fastest decision, it rewards the calmest one." Most visitors believed they were looking at old naval documents preserved behind glass. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable, a lifetime of experience, a promise carried through 27 years of silence, and the timeless reminder that the greatest commanders are remembered not for how loudly they gave orders, but for how carefully they learned to listen before giving them. The applause slowly faded, but no one hurried to leave the simulator. Every officer candidate understood that they had just witnessed something far more valuable than a perfect training run. Master Chief Robert Callahan slowly stood from the command chair and rested one hand on its worn metal frame. He looked around the control room with a gentle smile. "You know what every one of you did wrong today?" The candidates looked at one another before quietly shaking their heads. The ocean has always been one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. It does not care how young you are, how strong you are, or how confident you feel. Beneath the surface, there are no spectators, no second chances, and no room for panic. Every decision carries consequences measured not only in seconds, but in human lives. Master Chief Robert Callahan understood that truth because he had lived it. He had learned that the greatest danger aboard a submarine is rarely the water outside the hull. It is the fear inside the people making decisions. Commander James Harris left behind a lesson that reaches far beyond the Navy. He believed that technology would continue improving, computers would become faster, and instruments would become more accurate. But the one quality every commander would always need was the ability to remain calm when everyone else was overwhelmed. Calmness is not the absence of fear. It is the discipline to think clearly while fear is present. That is the difference between reacting to a crisis and leading through one. The young officer candidates made the same mistake many of us make every day. They believed success depended on acting quickly. They rushed from one alarm to the next, trying to solve every problem as soon as it appeared. Robert showed them something entirely different. Sometimes the fastest way to fail is to move before you understand what is really happening. Sometimes the bravest decision is to pause for one more second, listen more carefully, and allow experience to reveal what panic tries to hide. Robert often said that submarines speak to those willing to listen. While most people hear only noise, experienced sailors hear patterns, changes, warnings, and opportunities. The same principle applies to life. Families, friendships, workplaces, and communities all speak in quiet ways long before serious problems appear. The people who pay attention to the smallest changes are often the ones who prevent the greatest tragedies. Wisdom begins with listening. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when Master Chief Robert Callahan completed the simulator exercise that 12 younger officers had failed, nor when Captain Rebecca Lawson saluted him before the entire training center. It was the quiet moment when Robert finally opened Commander Harris's letter after 27 years and discovered that the greatest lesson had never been about submarines at all. It was about people, about trust, about patience, about choosing clear judgment over hurried confidence. Those are lessons that remain valuable whether we are beneath the ocean, leading a family, running a business, teaching a classroom, or simply helping someone through a difficult day. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a veteran, teacher, mentor, coach, parent, or friend whose quiet wisdom helped you avoid a mistake you never even realized was coming? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, leadership, courage, sacrifice, friendship, honor, wisdom, second chances, and the extraordinary people whose calm decisions quietly changed countless lives. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every sailor serving beneath the sea. Protect every crew standing watch far from home. Strengthen every leader entrusted with the lives of others. Comfort every family waiting for a safe return. And remind all of us that the greatest strength we will ever possess is not the ability to react faster than everyone else. It is the wisdom to remain calm long enough to make the right decision. And may you never forget that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already survived the storm everyone else is only beginning to face.